LEGO Indiana Jones 2 The Adventure Continues is the worst game in the Traveler's Tales LEGO series. I feel fairly confident in this judgment despite not having played every game yet, because I've started the next game in the series and they hard corrected some of this game's extremely severe issues. As opposed to a simple compilation with new content like LEGO Star Wars had in the Complete Saga, The Adventure Continues takes an ambitious and questionable hard left into focusing more on the overworld than the levels. In addition to the original 3 movies, The Adventure Continues adds the then recent Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, stretched to its limits into 3 parts, but honestly, the way levels are structured means it still doesn't feel like it takes up very much space. The Adventures Continues was a purely next-generation affair at the time, only releasing on the Wii, Xbox 360, PS3, and PC, with conversions for both the DS and PSP. The Adventure Continues focuses on a very different gameplay loop from its predecessor, however most of the mechanics from before are still in place. Finding items like wrenches and shovels to gain abilities, using a few immutable traits in the same way, like soldiers being able to open soldier doors, Indy's whip to whip things, and women high jumping to get to areas that other characters can't, and so on. Only a small amount of new abilities were introduced in this game. A few thuggy characters have a potion that lets them control certain NPCs from a distance, Oxley can use the crystal skull to scare off animals, a few women have perfume which turns enemies against each other, spears can be embedded into certain walls to add bars to jump off of, the torch can light certain things on fire, and water can put fire out. The same basic combat returns, as do vehicles, which are pretty much free of any restrictions. Levels for them tend to be much wider and more open to allow you to use them as tools for exploration, although this doesn't tend to work out as they usually just throw you into a big, mostly empty map to ram into other vehicles, and the vehicles do not control very well. The Adventure Continues' biggest stumbling block is the way the game is structured. Each movie, or in the case of Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, a third of a movie, has its own little open world hub. Prior games used hub worlds as glorified level selects to the point where I never really bothered talking about them, with big obvious doors to the next area, a shop for characters and extras, and maybe a few side areas with some bonus levels in them. In this game, however, the hubs basically are the game. Between levels, and I'll get to the issues with those in a second, the game tosses the player back into the hub. You do occasionally solve puzzles here, as well as fight off random goons, but it's largely an exercise in stumbling around looking for the next level, at least during the story. A majority of the game's content is here. Characters and vehicles are found behind small puzzles or extremely bad races. The vehicles kinda just feel like they've been made extra slippery and prone to flipping, which, while occasionally funny, is extremely frustrating when the races ask for some amount of precision on a timer, and they just don't work. The game's collectibles are also moved to the hub outside of this. Each hub has 3 objects in groups of 10 hidden around, and destroying all 10 of these awards an extra. These can be scorpions, cacti, flowers. They're both spread out and tiny thanks to the extremely wide angle the game takes in hubs, which often makes it very tedious, and that's on top of the new split screen system, which is a complete mess. The new split screen works, it allows the players to be untethered from each other, which is nice. But instead of just making a standard horizontal or vertical split screen, as pretty much everything else did at the time, it uses this dynamic split screen thing that's kind of a neat tech trick, but also very distracting, where players will split the screen depending on where they are in relation to each other. So if one player's at the top corner of a map and one's at the opposite corner, it'll be a diagonal split. But as they rotate around each other, it'll rotate with them, and it gets very disorienting, and you'll be like swapping sides of the TV you're supposed to look at because you're not always on the left side of your friend, and it's very odd, it's very convoluted, and probably would have been better if it was just simpler. Each of these worlds also has 11 bonus levels. Yeah, 11. Each of the 10 bonus levels awards a golden chest, and all 10 together unlocks Lego City. There are 6 Lego Cities in this game because we needed more of that. Despite being kinda tedious, the open worlds are the better part of the game. As you begin to unlock more and more, it snowballs into a fairly simple puzzle box that continues to open up as you explore, and it can actually be pretty satisfying, which is probably why these sorts of hubs would remain in the series going on, although better balanced with actual levels and usually condensed into one more well thought out hub world. The levels themselves are bad. Main missions are segregated into 4 groups. Exploration missions play mostly like the older games, simple puzzle solving, platforming, and some dudes to punch. However, levels in this game are like 5 minutes long. It was clearly a rushed affair with the effort going into other aspects, and as such, every level feels like a 4th or a 5th of a level in any of the prior few LEGO games, stripped back into nothing but padding. The next type is combat. In a LEGO game, you punch guys for like 3 minutes until you've killed enough and it instantly ends. If the exploration missions were padding, the combat levels feel like an obligation to fill out 5 main missions for each game. Something insane to say in a game based on a series that's largely a series of action set pieces strung together by a loose plot. Vehicle missions tend to be the longest, but also the least enjoyable. These vehicle missions often take place in fairly large hubs and consist of ramming whatever vehicle the game gives the player into mindless enemy cars that circle the map. It's not fun. Lastly, boss missions. These are the kind of puzzle bosses that would normally cap off a level in a prior game, and if they were, I would probably enjoy it. But now they're their own little levels. Altogether, 5 levels of movie ends up being generously 2 levels from the first game. It's also notable levels have no collectibles outside of True Jedi, which is just reaching a certain money threshold, which maybe is for the better given how these levels look. As for bonuses, treasure missions take place inside of prior levels, sort of like a remix, and I think that's kind of a cool idea. However, they lack enemies and instead are focused on solving extremely simple puzzles, and most of them are even shorter than their original main mission counterparts. They're not very exciting, and it doesn't get much better with the vehicle treasure missions, where the player roams a dead empty map to pop 10 balloons. I don't even know what to say anymore. The proper bonuses are actually a touch better. They're all seemingly made with the in-game level creation tool. I'll come back to that in a second, and serve as tiny one-room platforming challenges or little puzzle boxes that are relative to the rest of the game, usually decently paced and exciting, and I imagine for some gave them inspiration for their own levels. As for the 6 entire LEGO City missions, they're fine. Bizarrely enough, despite being tied so closely to the game's hub world system, they don't feature any special theming that ties them into the movie that they're based on. Instead, they're just generic little LEGO towns. Like the last few games, these newer LEGO cities are rather generous with extra money. There's no exact 1 million count or anything like that, so while they're still kind of tedious to go through, they aren't frustrating, just kind of boring. As for the level creator, I don't actually have that much to say about it. It's neat that it's very robust. You can raise the ground, lower the ground, there's tons of pieces to work with, and you have to buy a bunch of them to get 100% in this game. And you can place things pretty much anywhere and anyhow you like. However, it's all kind of clunky, doing all the menus, at least on the Xbox with the controller, and wheeling through like 8 different menus that all have multiple sub-pages. It's a lot. It feels very difficult to get around, and outside of doing the tutorials, I didn't mess with it much. The presentation is odd here too. I think that largely the game looks nice. The characters are all well rendered and smoothly animated, and I think the hub worlds are extremely cute. They take the miniaturized models of things from the movies to the extreme. The Raiders hub world starts out on the Tibetan mountain, and as you reach its base, it slowly transitions into the desert, with the island the Ark is opened on being its own little spot and so on. It's charming, however it's clear that this is where the effort kinda hits a wall. The levels themselves actually tend to, beyond being very, very small, be kinda unexciting and plain as far as it goes because they only ever incorporate 2 or 3 small rooms, leaving them feeling barren and often kinda low in detail. A third of the game's levels is made in the level builder, which, while it's neat that effort was put into showing what the tool can do, isn't that strong visually since it's a bunch of generic LEGO pieces slapped over a tiny little background. The cutscenes are also just all over the place. In the past games, you could get the gist of the story of the movie you were playing through as told through goofy pantomime, and there was a certain charm to that it was like adding gags on top of a story, even if details were left out due to the format, but here stuff is basically incomprehensible. The very odd level choices mean a lot of important stuff is outright skipped, but the cutscenes also tend to just be more general gags than goofy retellings. When the Ark is opened, a disco ball pops out and everyone does silly dances, and then the cutscene ends and it continues into the level. It just feels dumb. It's not charming, it's just kinda dumb. The game's level choices tend to be very bizarre, to say the least. Raiders of the Lost Ark skips the boulder chase, the most iconic part of the franchise, something that is essentially made to be a platformer level, and instead starts with a mediocre boss fight where Tot shoots a laser out of his hand in the bar and you deflect it back at him. The game then skips directly to the desert for a combat level in the market, which is about as nothing as you can get, jumps ahead quite a bit again to solving the puzzle of the Ark with the Staff of Ra, which is an okay little puzzle section. There's a brief desert vehicle mission. Every movie has at least one, and this barely has shit to do with the movie, and most of them are just kind of very tedious filler. And then you fight the Spirit of the Ark, a giant ghost that shoots lightning. The mechanic of covering yourself with a barrel is a neat idea, but it's another 5-minute boss and completely left field with regards to adapting the movie. I think they might have missed the point a slight bit. And that's it. 5-minute long levels, and then it ends. The bonuses don't do much to help this either. The treasure missions are just remixes of these, but without enemies. The bonuses are just all little platforming levels. They're just little level builder platforming levels. Temple of Doom starts right off the bat with its car chase in Shanghai. Jumps ahead to a mission where you go around finding bananas to recover the weird stones because you give the bananas to monkeys. It's actually one of the better levels in the game, weirdly enough, even though it's just like not a thing in the movie. Combat in the palace is its own mission, then on to fighting the little prince kid for a bit in the underground temple, and then another ridiculous final boss as Mola Ram becomes a giant rock man for reasons completely indiscernible to me. Short Round climbs into his hole and turns him inside out, a common sight in low-income Asian communities, unfortunately. Every movie in this game, for some reason, has to end on a giant boss that has nothing to do with the movie instead of just being normal. You could have just had a normal boss fight on the bridge. It would be that simple. The absolute normalization of levels has also led to a lot of the more interesting set pieces. For example, the minecart chase in Temple of Doom to be dropped for not fitting into the narrow framework of what levels can be. The Last Crusade starts at the scene that the previous game forgot, surprisingly, with the boat heist, even though it just turned into another mediocre boss fight where you throw chairs at a guy with a gun. We then jump to Indy and his dad in the fire, putting it out with water for about 5 minutes, which skips a lot of the movie. Then there's a 5-minute combat segment in Berlin against the Nazis, and then there's a generic vehicle mission, and then there's a boss fight against Donovan, you know, the guy who turns into a skeleton when he drinks out of the wrong grail. In this game, he becomes a tornado that you shoot with a rocket launcher. Yeah. If you're gonna go full retard, at least, you know, do something entertaining with it, like a giant Hitler or something. I mean, I guess it's nice that, like, before you fight the giant tornado, you still get to do, like, the floor puzzle part of the, you know, the part where he steps across the stones. But man, a lot of the game is just so fucking nothing when it comes to levels. Kingdom of the Crystal Skull can at least say it's mostly intact. Having 15 levels helps with that. Part 1 covers everything before Peru. The large storage hangar is one of the better levels in the game, presumably because you're forced to play it first, featuring a small bit of exploration, puzzle solving to get to the back before using the rocket engine to fight a simple boss. It almost tricks you into thinking the game might turn out to be good. Hell, even the Call of Duty Nuketown level that comes right after is a neat little exploration level with cool theming, but then the other shoe drops. There's a combat mission in the diner, a very clunky vehicle mission on a motorcycle, then the big stupid boss of part 1, a train with robot arms that you need to pull apart. I watched this movie for this video and I have no idea why there's a robot arm train. There's one scene with the train and Indy gets on it, and then he gets off it. Everything in this game makes you sound insane, and if any of this stuff was in the movies, they would be bad. Part 2 picks up in Peru, and again it starts okay with a little jailbreak exploration mission, then it transitions into a generic little puzzle in a Mayan rune, where you grab something and use the crystal skull to keep spiders away from you. Then there's another generic combat mission with the Russians, then an extremely lengthy vehicle mission where you're stuck in the giant, ridiculous tree choppy machine thing. Then boom, you get a boss fight against the fire ants that eat that guy in the movie. In that scene that's like 10 seconds long where Indy punches the guy into the fire ants. But instead of them eating him, he turns into a giant man made of ants, and you use the crystal skull to get the ants to go away and put traffic cones on the ant mounds, and then it blows up. It doesn't feel like a real game. There's no connection to the thing they're adapting. It's just kind of all over the place. Finally, part 3 is just the river stuff in the ending. It starts boring as hell with a mission to fix the boat car, goes into a vehicle mission with said car, then you place the crystal skulls on the pedestal to fight a Mayan guy who jumps down, and you drag him onto the spikes with the whip pull attack, which is actually kind of creative mechanically, and it's like the only time that something creative happens with the mechanics Then you use white imperialist tactics to beat up like a million native people on their sacred ground and just kill them. And then the big boss fight, you fight Ivana Spankov while she uses psychic alien powers to throw rocks at you while you shoot her with a bazooka. Why end with this instead of fighting the aliens? If you're gonna go stupid, you gotta go big with it. You gotta swing for the fences. Have Indiana Jones fighting the aliens, shooting them with rocket launchers still. I don't care, but why is it Spankov? I spoke briefly on the other movies in the prior LEGO Indie video, so I may as well talk about Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, something I haven't seen in a while and rewatched for this video. The first half of the movie is actually not bad. It's got its stupid stuff like the cartoon gophers, the general softballing on the violence, and Mac is kind of just a bizarre character. But Mud and Indy have a nice dynamic, and there's some legitimately good action scenes. The opening one in the warehouse, the motorcycle chase, the diner brawl. It's really not until the group gets to Peru that the movie falls apart and falls apart hard. Indy has no reason not to work with the Russians beyond the vague notion that maybe the Crystal Skull could be turned into a super weapon, and they both end up at the same place together anyways and kind of just work together in the end. So the really stupid cartoony CGI action scenes in the middle, like the sword fight on the cars and Mutt swinging through the trees with the monkeys, and the part where they drive the car off the cliff onto the tree like Looney Tunes, and the fire ants. All that stuff just kind of ends up being pointless fluff in the end. And it all looks really bad, and it's all just like CGI blur mess. It has aged very bad, but it wasn't very good when it came out, I can tell you that. Tying it all back to Marion is kind of weird too. A character who appeared in the first of 3 movies as a Bond girl-esque throwaway character before the next one came up, returning as some weird emotional core because Steven Spielberg is old now. He wanted Indy to settle down with Marion, and like they kind of set up that Mutt's just gonna take over and be the next Indiana Jones, but people didn't like this movie, so the Shia LaBeouf Indiana Jones reboot sequel thing just fell through, and then in the new movie they killed him in Vietnam off screen. It all ends up coming together in a very stupid finale. I don't entirely hate the aliens thing, given that Indy has always been a campy throwback to cheap serials. But in the end, they shoot up some natives, Ivana Spankov turns to dust, and Mac trips over himself while the UFO is going to the other dimension because they're not aliens, they're like interdimensional things. And Mac trips and is like, I don't feel like standing up. He could have just stood up and been fine. And he looks at Indy and says, I'm gonna be okay. And then he gets sucked into the vortex. And then it just kinda ends. Like the UFO comes out of the temple and Indy goes, wow, that's a UFO. And then Oxley says it's going to the other dimension. And it's just kinda weird and stupid. And it doesn't feel like anything concludes. There's no, nothing ties this movie together. It's a series of exceedingly bad action scenes. It's a series of extremely bad action scenes starting in the second half that climaxes at some people falling in a dimensional portal and then everyone goes home. If the energy of the first half of the movie was carried through the whole thing, it'd be a solid movie, I think. But like Mac, it kind of just trips over itself and decides to die at that, unable to pick itself back up and course correct, and it kind of just stumbles along to a sad, pathetic end. And I don't know, the first half is alright, the second half is real bad. LEGO Indiana Jones 2 The Adventure Continues is bad, real bad, but it's not entirely meritless. The levels are barely, really is the best way to put it. The cutscenes are a mess, and it barely attempts to adapt the movies outside of some surface level similarities in settings and characters. But even still, the overworlds are fairly well made for what they are. Maybe a little convoluted, maybe some of the hidden objects are too subtle, maybe the races could have just been cut entirely and nobody would have missed them. But it's actually very satisfying to run around picking at loose threads to gain new characters and vehicles that loosen their own threads and slowly open up new areas, races, and characters in that sort of number go up way. Had these hubs been merged into one larger one and had the levels been levels, I think this ambitious new step really would have paid off. Thankfully, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that this is growing pains, as the games following this one would largely do what I just said. 1 or 2 larger, more elaborate overworlds that connect a smaller amount of longer, more focused levels will allow the games to both be tiny little open world puzzle games and more straightforward action platformers with more tightly designed puzzles and challenges. Indiana Jones 2 was just the unfortunate first step on this new path to a new style Lego games.